And hello, everyone. What a beautiful Monday. I'm Colombe, this is Andrea, and today we will be speaking about supranational organizations.
Big topic, exciting one.
Sounds really boring, but it's actually really cool, I promise. So let's recap, Andrea. Tell us who we are, what we're doing, what this broadcast is, how people can participate.
So this broadcast is called How to Build a Country. It's part of a wider project of Atlas, the international global movement that Colombe and I founded a couple of years back now. And the idea of this broadcast is basically explaining and crowdsourcing idea and sharing views on how we can move from a national-based governance system, the one that is ruling the world, to a more global one, a more democratic one where each voice, your voice, our voice can be heard on how to tackle climate change, how to stop nuclear wars, and all the topics that our nation states are facing massively to tackle today. We started this broadcast a couple of weeks back, and this week we all always.
No, you're going too fast.
I'm going too far.
We're going to get to that. I'm going to make the link in just a second.
Go for it.
So we're talking about how to build a country because we think that we need a global governance that is democratic, kind of like a global country, democratic, and it doesn't exist right now. So someone has to build it, and Atlas is making it its mission to do it.
Exactly.
And so this COMS effort is an effort part of this endeavor to build a global democratic country. Basically, we want to brainstorm with you all, so please comment, send us your ideas and so on the issues that the current world order faces. So we're using this broadcast as a way of exploring, last week we talked about what's wrong with nation states, how nation states were built and so on. This week we're looking about a different angle, which is supranational organizations. And then we'll look at their failures and their successes so that we can actually understand what a new world order should look like. The rest of the work Atlas is doing is in January, we'll start consultations, on-the-ground consultations, in order to be able to crowdsource what a global governance should look like. And we'll then work to make it happen.
Exactly.
Andrea, do you want to recap what we talked about last week when we talked about countries?
Yes. So for the big memories I have after a long weekend of work, last week we talked about the history and the reason why countries are there. And basically what we came out with was a very, I think, powerful message, at least for us.
You can't qualify your message as powerful.
The fact that nations are sadly evil in the age we live in too, because they are the source of a lot of the problems we experience, from famine to wars to the inability of countries to come in together or humanity to come in together to tackle climate change. These are all due to the fact that we have nations, and so there is national interest and many problems linked to that. So last week we analyzed basically why we live how we live right now and how come nation exists, and basically the negative aspect that nations have on our current historical moment. And this week
we will talk about supranational organizations. So to recap, what's wrong with nations is national interests first lead to increased risk of conflicts, and whether internal or external. And it leads to global challenges like COVID, like climate not being dealt with. It leads to borders being put in place, which are stupid because they don't work really well, as we explained in a video on the case for open borders that you can find on YouTube. And it leads to the fact that we are not truly represented at the global level, and more differences are brought up when we should be embracing our commonalities and working together. So let's look at supranational organizations and compare, see what's the link and so on. To get started this week, we're going to talk about the history of supranational organizations. And so I prepared the episode. Every day there's someone who prepares the episode and someone who just stands there and comments so that it's not boring as hell for the other person. Andrea, can you tell us what you know about the history of So first of all, if I tell you supranational organizations, what do you actually know? And then what do you know about the history?
So when I hear the term supranational organization, I think there are either alliances or similar institutions coming from the fact that countries want to collaborate on certain things. That's what I get when I hear the term.
Wrong. We'll get to that. Okay.
Great start.
It's still going
it's good. Because you prefer the episode. So
I'm so happy you're my co-founder on this project.
Okay, so tell me. Okay, so this is what I think about supranational organization.
Okay, before I tell you what it is, what do you know about the history?
So This I know a bit more because I learned some stuff in the
But
last
if
few
you
months.
don't know what they are,
If I think about the big ones, I think about the League of Nations, the United Nations, the European Union. So the one that in the last, let's say, 100 years have started appearing on the political landscape. And
so what's the League of Nations?
The League of Nations is basically the old grandparents of of the United Nations. It's the organization that came before the United Nations after First World War and failed to prevent Second World War.
So much knowledge to feel. So I'm very happy that I prepared this episode.
Well, it's good. Go for it.
So let's get back to the basic. What is a supranational organization? It's a type of international organization that is empowered to directly exercise some of the powers and functions otherwise reserved to states. A supranational organization involves a great transfer or limitation of state sovereignty than other kinds of international organizations. I'm going to send the definition because it's complicated. So basically, a supranational organization or union is something that takes away some of the state powers and administers it itself. This is the title of today's episode, supranational. I'm going to give you a big disclaimer. There's only one organization that is considered to be supranational in today's world, according to experts. It's the European Union.
Okay.
Nothing else. And that's because none of the others actually do that, actually have a lot of competencies that states normally have. So the European Union is considered the only supranational organization. You then have other types of international organizations. So international organizations include things like the UN, like the World Trade Organization. They include, to a certain extent, the G20. They include the African Union, the Organization of American States, and also, for example, the Organization of Turkic States, and so on.
Okay.
And they are different, and they encompass international organizations, intergovernmental organizations. So those are a type of international organizations that are composed primarily of sovereign states. Sometimes there's also others, and that are created through formal treaties for handling serving common interests governed by international law. So the United Nations are an intergovernmental organizations. And they are different from, for example, the G7 or the G20, that are just a group or coalitions. They're not made for a treaty, and they're not governed by international law. And they don't have like a constituent document, basically.
Okay.
So they're a task group. They're not an intergovernmental organization. I just thought it was interesting to clarify the definitions for those of us that don't actually know.
Very interesting. Can you repeat it in a very simple way?
So supranational organization basically is a super international organization. So it's an international organization that has some of the competencies and power that normally states have.
Okay.
As such, only the EU is today considered this, because you have a parliament that represents the citizens. It administers directly administers certain competences that used to be reserved to states.
Okay, clear.
So that's supranational organization. It's a super like boosted international organization.
Okay. Clear.
Then you have international organizations that are a broad compass, and basically in them you have treaty alliances, you have coalitions like the G20, and you have intergovernmental organizations. Intergovernmental organizations are different from the rest because they are based on a treaty. So they have a constituent document. Okay. And they are governed by international law for a shared common interest. Like the United Nations is to protect peace and security. They have a founding charter, they follow international law, and they have member states. It differs to the G20 that does. It has member states, but it doesn't have the rest.
Very clear. Thank you.
That is...
so more or less I was right when I said...
No.
Okay.
So that's what we have right now. And then you have countries, right? Which we talked about and it's helps. Considering this is what we have, I wanted to look at the history. And when I Googled and went on Wikipedia, which is my primary source of information a lot of the time, international organizations, well, one, I found a difference about all of this, but I found very little. I found like the United Nations, the League of Nations that we'll get to. But I was like, so is it such a modern concept?
Yeah.
And it's actually not. And that's thanks to the fact that I remembered something super interesting on the summer trip I took this summer. I went on the coast of Turkey. And in between many summer activities, I saw something called the home of the Lycian League. And I thought it was worth mentioning. I would never have come across it unless I literally stumbled into it. Because when you Google, again, global cooperation, intergovernmental organizations, and so on, you find just the UN, and it's mainly like a Western Einstein approach, and not a general like history of this. But when you Google the Lycian League, one, you find very different facts from very different centuries. But let me just tell you about this really cool concept.
So this is something in Turkey, right?
Yes.
Okay.
What is now known to be Turkey. It's Southwest Anatolia. And let me tell you about this really cool concept, because I think it's basically Atlas before its time. And so I think it's really cool. So the Lycian League, which is spelled, because I'm probably mispronouncing it, Lycian. And some people say it was created in the 4th century before Christ. Some say in the 1st century before Christ.
Okay.
I think it was more the first from one of the sources I've read. It was comprised of 23 cities that formed a league. The Lycian League, from its language, when it translates, it actually directly translates into standing together, which you'll see why I think is super cool. It might have been formed to fight against the tyranny of Rhodes, where Lycian people were being enslaved, which was insane, and so on. So basically what happened is you had 23 cities that said, no, we want to fight for freedom, we want our independence, we want our freedom, and let's join forces across those 23 cities in this region, form a common parliament. So they had a shared parliament, and proportional shared parliament.
Impressive.
And that all of the male resident citizens of the cities could vote for. So it was the 1st century before Christ, right?
Yeah.
So like it's better than
Still
what we have in a lot
therefore.
of places. So
Exactly.
all of the male residents could vote for. And to tell you just a bit more about it, the parliament was responsible for financial affairs, trade affairs, economic, religious, and legal matters of the Lycian life. So, for example, it administered marriage laws and so on, which is so cool. It's
Very
honestly
cool.
so cool.
Very
It's the first known democratic federation in history. It was a federation of 23 cities. Like at the time you had city-state, right? It's super cool.
Incredible.
And it's inspired modern-day democratic systems, apparently. We just don't find it a lot online. So in the system, principal cities had 3 votes, while the others had 2 votes or 1, depending on their size. The proportional election system of the representatives of this parliament, depending on the size of the cities, were unique in the ancient times.
Incredible.
It's super cool, which is why I said I love the translation, which is standing together. So literally it's 23 cities that were like, no, we need to fight for basic civility, for freedom and so on. Let's stand together, we'll be stronger. And they actually managed to stand together despite the fact that there were constant attempts to overtake it. And there were constant threats of invasions. It was very mountainous, the terrain and so on. And they managed to keep it up for quite a while. And the Lycian League went up until, I think, 43 after Christ. And so it's a few hundred years, right? At least more than 100 years.
Yeah.
Which is incredible in the time. Like a democratic federation that was representative in order to fight for freedom.
Did they have veto power?
They did not have veto power. It was proportional.
So it's really it's way better than what we have today.
Exactly, which is so cool. Just so you know, a few more information that I could find. The major cities of this federation were Patara, being the capital city. It's where you have the parliament. If you go there, you can actually visit the parliament. It's so cool. I'll try to put a picture that I took on the video after. Xanthos, Pinara, Olympos, Myra, and Pseudos. I'm probably mispronouncing all of them. And they all had 3 votes because they were bigger, and they were later joined by Phaselis.
Okay.
And you had then all of the other cities.
So if I understand correctly, basically these cities created a league. That is kind of what we have today.
It's a federation.
It's a federation. And even they have proportional voting depending on the size of each city.
So they had 3 or 2 representatives. So they voted for a representative. And it wasn't completely proportional based on the population, but basically the biggest cities had 3 and the other had 2.
Very interesting. And they kept it up for more than 100 years.
And they actually administered a lot of topics. Again, trade is huge between those cities. Economic, like marriage, religious, and so on. They had their own language. They had a coin. Like, it was super integrated.
Super interesting.
It's amazing, no?
And it's crazy that like this 2,000 years ago, they had it in a way more efficiently done than many of the things we do today, where if you have a small country, you can block the whole world right now.
So give a concrete example.
So I think about the United Nations, where they have 5 countries, namely the US, Russia, China, the UK, and France, that have basically a veto power on everything that goes on in the UN that matters. They are the permanent members of the Security Council. So on peacekeeping operation, peace deals, anything, including the election of the leader of the UN, they can basically veto it. So if they don't like it, they say, no, we don't want to stay. And it was done at the beginning to basically create this system, but it shows how, compared to 2,000 years ago, actually 2,000 years ago, cities and countries, or the cities were way more selfless. They understood that it's not because you don't like someone that no one else can do it. Right now, in the current system, we behave basically like children at school. Like if I don't like what I do, I'm taking away the ball. That's how we do it. And same in the European Union, by the way, because the European Union, it has a body built around the heads of state of each country, and in many fundamental matters, basically you need unanimity. Means that even if one person doesn't want out of 27,
policy and so on,
you don't go ahead. So it shows how less mature we are in a way in terms of federation and governance.
Yeah. So the reason for which I wanted to mention this is because when we think again of like supranational organization, we think only of the UN or this type of things. But there's actually been a lot of experiments that were really, really, really smart. And again, on the Lycian League, there's little because it was so long ago. So you find debated dates and so on. It existed. There was a parliament. There are writings about it, historical writings, but we don't know everything about it. What is clear, though, is they had a very good system that lasted a very long time and that we can get inspired by. And so it shows a way forward of how, despite your differences, despite the fact that at the time, even if it's in one region, it's further away, it worked. I've read some historical texts that said that it's also this very league that is credited, so this union and unity, that is credited for managing to keep out invaders for so long, and that their common strength was stronger as a result. So I find it very beautiful. So just to tell you, in 43 AD, the Roman Emperor Claudius dissolved the League, and Lycia was incorporated into the Roman Empire with provincial status. But until then, it existed with the names standing together. Again, I wanted to start from there because it's a bit of a different story. From this point on, I didn't do 2,000 years of research of history. I'm sure you have a lot of other.
Sure, yeah.
And please, if you know of any of them, send me whatever examples you have of international, supranational, intergovernmental organizations that have existed throughout time. I did a jump from basically the 1st century before Christ to the 1900s. So there's a lot in between, but it was just to kind of challenge the common narrative. And it's also what we're trying to do in those videos of, this is something super recent, etc. So that for me, I said supranational organization is something that takes over certain state competences. The Lycian League is the first truly supranational organization.
Incredible.
It's not in any Wikipedia definition or whatever about the supranational organization. So whoever it is, Wikipedia, if you watch this, please add it. It's super cool. It's the first example. It was democratic. It was great. Women didn't have the right to vote. Let's change this in the future, but still. But I think it's something worth remembering.
Very interesting. And it shows, as you said, I think it's really powerful to see that it's not like something that cannot be done.
Yeah.
If it was done 2,000 years ago without technology or anything else.
Exactly. Now, before jumping to the next organizations that I want to talk about, I wanted to do a bit of a thinking around supranational. As I said, it's something that takes over certain state competences. I'm dumbing it down just because it's easier to talk about it this way, right? So the EU has been described as the best case of supranational organization because it has the political, economic, and social integration, even though it's extremely imperfect, as Andrea just explained, with a veto right, basically through unanimity decision-making on certain stuff like foreign, etc., like foreign policy, sorry. But it still includes a common market, joint borders, a Supreme Court, a regular popular election for the European parliamentary elections, and so on. This idea of supranational started emerging, so to go back a bit, because since it's the only one existing, why and what has happened. When you read about supranational, it says that it emerged after Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945. And it's Albert Einstein that spoke and would frequently in the late 40s about supranational organizations and to control the military forces, all military forces. So his idea is all military forces should be controlled by a supranational organization, but for local police forces. And his idea was we need a supranational organization for nuclear weapons. Again,
which makes sense.
This is what common text said. I believe this is not where supranational comes from, but from the Lycian League, from my very limited understanding of history, but still. But so he started speaking a lot about it. And he wanted the supranational order to start with the United States, with the United Kingdom, and the Soviet Union, and then to grow to encompass other nations. Quite interestingly, the West was quite against it, and the Soviet Union was quite wary of it. So his idea gained popularity because he was famous, but states were a bit like, not really.
Yeah, because they want to give out sovereignty, I guess.
Exactly. And he used the word supranational. Then you have international, cut me at whatever you want.
No, go ahead. Super interesting.
Then you have international organizations, right, that I mentioned. Do you know what the oldest one is?
Or international organization? Actually, no, because I remember Googling it a few weeks ago. Is the International Telecommunication Union or something like that?
Yeah.
They weren't giving like prefixes and country codes. No, 18 something.
1865. So it's the first and oldest international organization, that is still in use today, I would add, that was established with a treaty. It has a secretariat. It has a global membership. It was founded in 1865.
Incredible. 1865.
Initially, so it's actually a super important one, the ITU, but we don't know about it. Initially, it had a different name. I don't remember its name. It was aimed at helping connect telegraphic networks between countries. And it was basically to advance on new communication technologies. And then its expanded responsibility took over radio and the telephone. And in 1947, it entered into an agreement with the newly created UN to become a specialized organization of the UN system or agency. And it did so in 1949. Today, it promotes the shared global use of radio, facilitates international cooperation when it comes to assigning satellite orbits, assists in developing and coordinating worldwide technological standards, and so on.
Mm-hmm.
It's also super active when it comes to broadband internet, wireless technologies, aeronautical, and so on. So it's huge. It has 193 countries that are members. And it's really big, but we don't really know about it a lot. But 1865, so it's a really old organization.
Incredible. Super interesting. I didn't know so.
Yeah. So that was the first one. And then the first general, you mentioned it earlier, so you didn't get everything wrong. The first general international organization that addressed a lot of issues was the League of Nations. Do you want to tell us a bit about the League of Nations?
So what I remember from history class in my high school, the League of Nations was
a long time ago.
Was a long time ago. The League of Nations was an organization created after the First World War to basically prevent wars. And the idea was they want to pulling together countries and ensuring that there was a way to resolve conflict. And I think they also studied the idea of having global passports. It was kind of forward-looking from what I remember. But the problem is that basically when fascism and Nazism came up, they were completely armless, unable to stop them and unable to deal with them in any meaningful way. That's what I remember.
Yeah, so I didn't know about the passports. So that's a good addition. And 1.1 there. So it was founded on the 10th of January, 1920 by the Paris Peace Conference.
Okay.
And this is a conference, in case you didn't know, that ended the First World War.
It was all in Paris again.
Yeah. Sorry, everyone, we've had a long weekend of work. And it ceased its operation on the 20th of April, 1946. But many of its components were relocated into the new UN, right? So I mean, there's a few things that are interesting here. Its creation really broke apart. It was a big shift from diplomatic philosophy before. So it created a union. Well, a union is actually the wrong word. An organization of a lot of countries that came together theoretically for peace and security, kind of like the UN today. It actually it was completely dependent on the victorious countries of the First World War. So it has exactly the same issues as the United Nations, because the United Nations is completely dependent on what are considered the victors of the Second World War. It has a P5, the permanent members that can veto stuff and so on. And the League of Nations was completely dependent. It didn't have its own armed forces, just like someone else. And as a result, depended on the First World War allies. So Britain, France, Italy, and Japan were the permanent members of the Executive Council. So it had also permanent members in an Executive Council.
Incredible.
And they were responsible for enforcing its resolution, keeping up its economic sanctions, and providing an army when needed. However, they were often, if not always, reluctant to do so. because sanctions could hurt League members, so they were really reluctant to comply with them. So getting into this whole mess was not a win-win for anyone. And it was during, I think it was a war between Ethiopia and Italy, when Italy was committing, again, countless massacres, human rights violations, and so on, that the League said something. And I think it was Mussolini who made a famous sentence, like, it's not capable of dealing with it.
Yeah.
When it was the biggest, so between 34 and 35, again, it was created in 1920 and died in 46. But between 34 and 35, it had 58 members. It has some successes and some failures in the early 20s, but what ultimately killed it is that it was incapable of preventing the aggression by the Axis powers in the 30s. So its credibility was completely weakened by the fact that the US also never joined. And then permanent members, so Italy, Japan, and then also Germany and Spain quit it.
So all the fascist countries basically left.
And the Soviet Union joined late and was expelled after invading Finland. So it was always quite small.
Interesting that they expel countries. It's something that today they wouldn't do, even with the most.
But I guess at the stage you already had all of the fascists that were out, right?
So it was like a smaller club.
Exactly. And on the onset of the Second World War in 1939, it showed that the League had failed its primary purpose. So it was inactive until its abolition. I think I read somewhere that literally its secretariat, which was in Geneva, was empty. So there was no one in the office for like 6 years.
Really?
Yeah.
Incredible.
It's completely empty. I think probably transferred its power to the Secretary General, who didn't do anything. So overall, it's lasted for 26 years. Key takeaways for me, it has, the UN was transformed. So for me, the UN was kind of the phoenix of the League of Nations, right? The League of Nations was created. It was a big shift in international diplomacy. Countries came together, were supposed to work together, and then it didn't fulfill its purpose, so it's died, but the UN took over. However, for me, one of the big issues is that it relied on the victors of the First World War, the Executive Council, to do everything. And the UN relies on the victors of the Second World War to block everything. So kind of the same dynamics. And we tend to see it as a failure because obviously it ended up in the Second World War, so it didn't end up super well. But scholarly consensus views that even if it failed to achieve its main goal, it did manage to build new roads towards expanding the rule of law across the world, strengthening the concept of collective security, and giving a voice to smaller nations that would not have been otherwise heard. And it actually helped raise awareness about problems like epidemics, slavery, child labor, colonial tyranny, refugee crisis, and general working conditions throughout its numerous commissions and committees. And it paved the way for new forms of statehoods, as the mandate system put the colonial powers under international observation.
Very interesting. So actually,
it did a lot. And it's been said that it basically institutionalized international affairs. And there's a saying that I think it's not really relevant, but I still wanted to say it. Robert Cecil, which was one of the founding fathers, because it only had fathers, of the League of Nations, in the final address in front of the final meeting of the League, said, "The League is dead, long live the United Nations." So clearly passing the power to it.
But so it's very interesting because even through the failures, of course, a lot of good things were crafted. There's something that we always say also about the United Nations, to be fair. But I didn't know that basically it was the first moment where international relations became a thing, like institutionalized. Exactly.
It was written down, it was thought through.
And obviously when you put countries together, you force them to cooperate, even if in an imperfect way, is the thinking for sure advanced so many things of how to deal with crisis, how to ensure a minimum amount of rights for everyone. So thank you, the League of Nations. They actually helped a lot.
Deeper.
Very deep.
Deep analysis.
Oh, this is good. So what happened after? So
now we have the UN.
Do you want to tell us a bit the story of the UN? Or it's boring?
It's not boring at all. I think so. In tomorrow's episode, we'll talk about the United Nations, the current world order, and its successes. Because I want to start with something positive. I always bitch about it. I want to start about something positive. So we'll talk about its successes and its failures and why we need to reform it. So for me, that's why I wanted to end with the sentence, "The League of Nations is dead, long live the United Nations." Because for me, we are arriving at the moment where the United Nations is dead or is dying. Long live what? Right? And it's what we're working on. It's the idea that the United Nations, and I hinted at it already, has many failures. Its basic governance is not democratic, doesn't work. We need something else. what is it? We're building a global democratic governance. We're trying to build it through consultations and so on. But what is next? When are we proclaiming this?
It's very interesting. I think the problem is sometimes this big shift in history happens when there is a massive tragedy. So the Second World War obviously closed a chapter and opened a new one. So sometimes I fear that this is what we are facing, that there will be a big clash at a certain point, and that will be a moment to turn a page.
But don't you think it's already happened with COVID?
It might already happen with COVID. It might be happening with climate. It might be happening in Russia, and Russia and Ukraine. So yes, I think time will tell. But I think that we are definitely at a turning point. It is clear that the current system does not hold. It's clear that it's completely unable to cope with the most basic challenges that we have ahead of us. So that's why I think that our work is needed.
Exactly. So tune in tomorrow for an episode on the current supranational or international world order and its successes. So it will actually be a positive one.
Thank you.